Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back here. We're talking about lesson 9 in psychology at this point. And the topic of this presentation is going to be principles of learning. And this is really an opportunity for us to take a look and see from a psychological perspective how people learn things, okay? And when we're talking about learning, we're talking about kind of a big uppercase L, not a lowercase l. And what I mean by the difference in that is we think of learning in the educational system as acquiring new information related to school. We're talking about a much broader sense. This is learning how to do anything, learning how behavior, anything. And so learning is a much larger topic than we're used to when we talk about it in terms of psychology. So that'll be the topic this particular lesson. We're going to spotlight a disorder, and actually it's a learning disorder. It's a neurological disorder, and it's called autism. And many of you are probably familiar with autism. It's a fairly common disorder, and one that has been getting a lot of attention recently as we've been trying to figure out why people may have autism, where they sit on the spectrum of autism, and what are some ways that we can assist those that have it. So we're going to talk a little bit about autism. And autism is a neurological disorder that's characterized by impaired social interaction. So the inability to act in a, and I'm using kind of quotations here, normal social behavior. And it also is characterized by repetitive behaviors. Some people with autism tend to have things that they occur over and over again. People like to stack things, or people like to turn things on and off, or it may be those kind of behaviors. And it really is, we don't know a huge amount about it. It's something that we're studying a lot, but we seem to think that it's a way that the disorder alters how nerve cells and synapses in the brain, we talked about those before, collect and organize information. So it's a neurological situation where the input that we see through our senses and the stimulation is being improperly coded. So we're not analyzing that data properly in the brain. We believe that it's linked to genetics, although there's been a lot of press about the possibility that it may be linked to things like vaccines or vaccinations and things like that. So we're not 100% sure. We believe that it's a genetic linkage. There is no cure at this point, but there is instruction that can take place. Social instruction can minimize the outward impaired social interaction and behaviors, things of that sort, where people can learn to behave in a way that is, again, in quotations, more normal than they would with this disorder. And people with autism can be very high functioning. There's autistic individuals in the community all the time that are exactly just like anyone else, and it's very hard to tell who has this disorder. Other people that are not as high functioning can need significant support and may not be able to live on their own. But most folks with high functioning autism can absolutely live productive and normal lives. So let's talk a little bit about learning. Let's talk about the principles of learning. We're going to talk about three main types of learning here in this particular lesson. But before we do that, let's define the term learning. Learning is, and again, this is the big L, a permanent change in an organism's behavior as a result of an experience. So I have an experience, I think about what that experience is, and I change my behavior accordingly. I have learned something. I'll use the classical example that they always use is that if you're a little baby and you put your hand up on the stove and you feel an unpleasant sensation of heat and you don't do that anymore, you have learned something. You have learned that if I put my hand on the stove, there's a negative situation that occurs, a painful situation, and I'm not going to do that anymore. Boom, learning has occurred. Okay? So it's as simple as that. And then there's lots of different ways to categorize learning. One of them is what's called classical conditioning. And that's when there's an association made between a stimulus, remember a stimulus just is something that we sense, and an outcome. So again, hand on stove, ouch, hurts, I'm not going to do that anymore, boom, classical conditioning. Operant conditioning, this is a learning from consequences of behavior. This is the one that we see an awful lot in school and things of that sort, learning. So we have a consequence from you doing something, and I'm going to learn accordingly, either in a positive, I'm going to do it over and over again because I like what the consequence is, or in a non-positive where, I didn't like the consequence, so I'm not going to do that anymore. Social learning, which is the third type of learning that we're going to talk about, is learning from observing the actions of others. So we see things happening out in our world, we see what happens when somebody does something, and boom, we've made an association and we've learned from it. That would be social learning. So let's talk about these one by one. We're going to start with classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was really put on the map by a biology professor, somebody who was not a psychologist. Matter of fact, he didn't believe much in the whole study of psychology because it was early in its day, back in the 1800s. And that's this fine-looking gentleman here, Ivan Pavlov. And Pavlov may be a word that you're familiar with because there's his main study was with dogs, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But what he did is he took a look from a scientific perspective at how an organism learned something. And he said that you could teach somebody something, or something, and he used dogs, as I say, to respond to what's called a neutral stimulus, a stimulus that had nothing to do with the response. So I could, by ringing a bell, make a dog salivate. Well, you would say, well, ringing a bell doesn't make you salivate. So how could that be? Well, here's the process that he used. He recognized that there were 4 things that needed to happen for this neutral stimulus to lead to a response. The first is you had to have an unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus is an event that leads to a predictable response. So, in his example, he had a dog, and a dog would salivate if they saw food. Matter of fact, most of us salivate if we see the right kind of food too. That's an unconditioned stimulus. That happens naturally. Nobody needs to teach that. An unconditioned response was the salivation. That's the reflex. I'm hungry, I see some food, boom, it's happening. I don't even do anything about it. It's unconditioned. A conditioned stimulus is an event that leads to a trained response. So this is where we're actually learning. So if we introduced something to the event that led to us to have this response, we have a conditioned stimulus. And a conditioned response then is that trained response. So that's a lot of terminology and it's a little confusing. So let's take a look and see exactly what Mr. Pavlov did. Mr. Pavlov had an experiment, and this is broken down pretty easily. You have a dog, and you had some food, and you had salivation. Pretty basic, okay? Before he did any kind of conditioning, any kind of teaching, any kind of learning occurred, these things happened. The dog saw the food, the dog salivated. Boom, pretty simple. What he did is he introduced the neutral stimulus. That was a bell. So he rang a bell, and the dog sat there and looked at him like, what are you doing? I don't understand what this bell's all about. There was no response. So once he conditioned the dog, however, what he would do is he would ring a bell and introduce the food. And then the dog would salivate. Why was the dog salivating? The dog was salivating because of the food. But the dog was also starting to associate this bell. Every single time he did it, rang a bell, here's some food, the dog. Okay, so the dog starts to see, okay, I think something's going on here. This bell is leading to the food. So then he removed the food, and he would ring the bell, and the dog would start to salivate because the dog had made the association. The dog had learned that there was an association between the bell and food. So that's a learned behavior. That's classical conditioning. Think about it. Let's use an example that you guys know, and that would be, how about the doorbell? We'll use the bell again. We'll use a doorbell. So the doorbell rings, and we open the door, and there's a person. And the doorbell rings, and we open the door, and there's a person. And the doorbell rings, and pretty soon we associate the fact that the doorbell means that there's a person at the door. There's nothing other than the fact that we have learned that behavior. It's something where we have been classically conditioned. The phone rings, we know that there's going to be a person on the other end. So the phone ringing doesn't have anything to do with the person. It's just that learned response that we've had. Okay, so that's classical conditioning. That's Pavlov. Where do we use classical conditions? Or a couple other things about classical conditioning. The acquisition of a new response occurs gradually and requires reinforcement. Think about the dog. He had to do this over and over and over again, ringing the bell, before the dog finally got the idea that the bell was associated with the food, and I'm going to salivate. And if you don't keep reinforcing it, it will go extinct, whatever the learned behavior is. So If Pavlov hadn't continued to do this association with the bell and the food and the dog, then pretty soon the dog would, you'd ring a bell and the dog would be back to where it was. It would be bored again and it wouldn't have that association yet. And that's called extinction. That's when it goes away. So you have to always have this continual reinforcement. We use classical conditioning all the time. It's used as part of advertising in our lives all the time. If you think about a jingle, and the reason that I have a picture of some deodorant on this page is not because you're stinky, but because this is a classic historical one, and we'll take a look at it in our case study this particular week, where a jingle, an advertising jingle, would lead to us wanting to buy something. That's the whole point of a good jingle. A slogan, the same thing, okay? Or images. And when we've got advertising companies that have done it well, when there doesn't have to be anything other than a image. Think about the swoosh, the Nike swoosh. You can see that on a piece of clothing. It does not have to say Nike clothing or Nike shoes or Nike whatever. We know exactly what that swoosh stands for. Okay, so that's good advertising, and we've been conditioned to that. Okay, so there's an application that we see in our daily lives. Another type of learning is called operant conditioning. So we had classical conditioning. This is called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is really dealing with the concept of how our voluntary behavior is impacted by consequences. Okay, so this is kind of the cause and effect of our voluntary behaviors. Things that we do, how are they reinforced? And the big person involved in this was a guy named B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner did some studies with mice back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, where he tried to see if he could teach mice to do certain things by giving them a positive response. Okay, and we have two things that are used in terms of operant conditioning, and this is a little confusing, so I want to make sure you understand this. The positive reinforcer makes sense. Positive reinforcer is we give an organism something after an action. So let's go back to our dog. If we want the dog to do something, or let's just think about training a dog in general. If you have ever trained a dog, what you do at first is if you want the dog to heel, you say heel, the dog heels, you give them a little treat. That's a positive reinforcer. Chances are the dog's going to say, hey, I'm willing to do this behavior because I'm getting something out of it. Okay? Think about I'll tell you about my salary. Okay? My salary is a positive reinforcer. My boss says, Mr. Carter, I want you to do this job. I do the job. I get reinforced by a salary. Boom. Pretty good. That's a positive reinforcer. A negative reinforcer, this is where it gets a little confusing. We associate the word negative with something bad, like we're punished in some way. This is not punishment. Negative reinforcer in this context is when we're talking about something is being taken away. Something unpleasant is taken away after an action that we do. So let's think about a prisoner. Let's think about a prisoner who maybe is being denied or is being made to do something that they don't want. Okay? So you're listening to horribly loud music that's blasted at a prisoner, and if the prisoner then gives up some information to the person that is interrogating them, they will take away the unpleasant act or the unpleasant activity. Okay? So that's a negative reinforcer. So it's not specifically something that's it's not where you're being negatively handled or hit or damaged or something. It's that we're removing something that the organism doesn't like. Let's talk a little bit more about reinforcers. In addition to the positive and negative, we have primary and secondary. So what are those? A primary reinforcer is a stimulus that satisfies some sort of a biological need. So it's a reinforcer that we've learned with food. Food is a perfect example. Food is a biological need. And people doing things or animals doing things for food is a pretty classic reinforcer. A secondary reinforcer would be a stimulus that is linked to a primary reinforcer. So let's say that we're doing something. My example of my salary is a secondary reinforcer. I'm being paid not in food, not in air, not in sleep. I'm being paid in money. But I can change that money into things that I need related to shelter or food. So that's a secondary reinforcer for behavior that we want to continue. Punishment, and here's the part where we get confused a little bit. Aversive control, this is a big terminology, talks about using unpleasant consequences to adjust behavior. Okay, so this is when we do something, and the classic example here is with children. If you've done something and we don't want you to do it anymore, we're going to give you an aversive control. We're going to give you a punishment. So you break a rule at your house, your mom or dad is angry, and you get spanked. That is punishment. That's aversive control. That's us trying to modify your behavior through a punishment. Okay. The picture that I've got here, the classical, we don't do this anymore, thank goodness, but back in the day, in school, you can talk to probably your grandparents would tell you about this. The dean at the school or the principal or the assistant principal would have the what's called the Board of Education, which is what this lady is holding right here. And so you would get some whacks with the Board of Education if you did something wrong at school. That's an aversive control, punishment, okay? And we found that there's a lot of disadvantages of that. The first of all is that it doesn't always just focus on the behavior, but sometimes it leads to anger. People are angry. They don't like to be punished. They're embarrassed by it. And so that there's going to be some response negatively that way. Or fearful. People become fearful, and we don't want to teach them fear necessarily. We wanted to teach them not to do a behavior. But there's some additional things that happen, effects that happen. Another one is that people tend to avoid the punisher. They're associating not their behavior with the response, but with the punisher. So now it's well, I'm just going to avoid you. It's not that I don't necessarily want to do the behavior. It's that I don't want to have anything to do with you because you're meting out or you're delivering this punishment. So that's a little bit of the way that we learn related to punishment too. Okay? So that's operant conditioning. We're going to talk about our last of the three is social learning. Social learning is where, again, we learn from watching and imitating others and what they do. And I've got a picture of kind of the classical family here because that's where we do most of our social learning. We're associated very young, from a very early age with our families. And that's where we watch the adults. We watch mom and dad. We watch grandma and grandpa. We watch aunt and uncle. We watch the people that are in our home interacting with their environment. And as little kids and as older people too, we are always taking that in and understanding how the world works from that behavior. Okay? Sometimes we have what's called learned helplessness. This is a type of social learning where we see that actions have no effect. So if there's something that we don't like that's happening or something that we want to try to gain, and we work towards it, and we see that there's no change in the stimulus, and we don't get any closer to what we want, or we don't get rid of the thing that we don't want, we can have what's called learned helplessness. And that would be another example of laziness. So, I try and I try and I try to do something, I never reach that, so I'm just going to stop trying. Learned helplessness, okay? Also in social learning, we have something called token economies. And token economies are a way to change behavior using a valueless object that can be exchanged for a reward. So think about if you ever had maybe some sort of a system, either in school or at home, where if you get a certain number of points, you can change those points in for a thing. Las Vegas, a great example, is that the token economy that we all know real well is down at the casinos. You get casino chips, you play the table games, you can turn those chips in for money. Okay, so token economies can be used, especially in like an educational setting, to try to change behavior of a person. So we see that happening an awful lot in schools. Okay, so there's a lot of information for you. It's dealing with learning in general. We'll take a look at that with a chapter this week as usual. We'll have an assessment, and then also you'll have a case study to take a look at. So work through the lesson if you would. If you have any questions, please contact me, and we'll talk to you soon.